classroom. I told the department chair repeatedly that placing an introduction to creative writing course at 8 a.m. on a Monday would be akin to placing a note in the course catalog telling students, "You don't have to show up, sleep in a few extra hours." Of course, this being my first semester as a full-time faculty member, I was overruled. This is in spite of the fact that
Sacrament begins from a place that deserves genuine and unhurried sympathy before any critique of the story's later choices can proceed, because Sovereign's poem, whatever else it eventually becomes entangled with, represents something real and valuable in its own right, the attempt of a young woman to process an overwhelming, disorienting feeling through the disciplined containment of language. And this impulse, reaching for metaphor, for the elevated vocabulary of devotion and worship, to describe a feeling too large and too confusing to say plainly, is one of the oldest and most legitimate functions of poetry itself, giving shape to longing that has nowhere else to go, and it would be a mistake to read Sovereign's use of intense, submissive imagery as simply a literal roadmap for what she wants to happen, rather than what it actually is, an attempt to externalize and understand an emotional experience that has clearly overtaken her, one she may not yet have the vocabulary or the life experience to process in any register other than the heightened, almost devotional language of infatuation. This distinction matters enormously because there is a considerable difference between a student privately writing about an intense crush using extreme, worshipful language, a common and developmentally unremarkable feature of how young people, and young queer people in particular, often first encounter the sheer force of attraction before they have any practiced way of metabolizing it, and a teacher reading that private, vulnerable expression and treating it as an invitation rather than as a student's interior process that happens to have become visible to her. And the story's critical failure lives precisely in this second move, in Kira's choice to read Sovereign's poem as encouragement rather than as a piece of writing that reveals a student in the grip of something she needs guidance navigating, not participation in. It is worth being direct about what Kira's professional position actually requires of her in this moment, because a professor encountering unmistakable evidence that a student has developed an intense romantic fixation on her, however beautifully or artfully that fixation has been expressed, holds a clear and unambiguous responsibility to respond with care that protects the student's well-being and academic standing rather than with personal gratification at being desired, and this responsibility exists precisely because the power differential between professor and student is not neutralized by the student's evident eagerness. A student's desire for her professor does not transfer responsibility for maintaining appropriate boundaries onto the student. That responsibility remains with the adult who holds institutional authority, who evaluates the student's work, who potentially shapes her academic and professional future, and Kira's decision to become enticed by Sovereign's declared submission and to close the distance with a kiss represents exactly the collapse of professional judgment that a story genuinely interested in queer women's authentic emotional lives should have the courage to depict as a failure rather than as a romantic culmination. The language of the poem itself, the imagery of goddess and devotee, of submission and yearning to kneel, deserves to be read specifically as a symptom of the power imbalance already present in the relationship rather than as an invitation to deepen it. Because a student casting her professor as a goddess to be worshipped is, whether Sovereign consciously intends this or not, already articulating the exact power differential that makes any reciprocation from Kira ethically fraught. Since the fantasy Sovereign has constructed is not one of equals meeting each other with mutual vulnerability, but one explicitly organized around hierarchy, elevation, and submission. And a teacher who reads this kind of language and responds not with concern about the intensity of what her student is experiencing, but with her own desire being stirred, is failing to recognize that the very framework the student has used to express her feelings already reveals how skewed the power dynamic between them is, making Kira's choice to act on it not a meeting of equals, but an acceptance of exactly the elevated, unequal position the poem has cast her in. This is worth contrasting directly with the earlier, more carefully considered version of Spencer's storyline, in which a mentor figure who recognizes charged feeling from a student in her care chooses, deliberately, and with real internal reckoning, not to act on that feeling, understanding that the authority gap between them makes any romantic reciprocation impossible to pursue responsibly regardless of how genuine her own affection might be. And Spencer's restraint in that version of the story was not coldness or rejection, but a form of respect, a recognition that the younger woman's well-being mattered more than the immediate gratification of mutual desire. And Holy Sacrament, as described, chooses the opposite path, allowing Kira's evident flattery and attraction to override the exact judgment that Spencer exercised. And this choice deserves to be read critically as a genuine narrative failure rather than romantically as a beautiful fated collision. Because a story that rewards the collapse of a professor's boundary with a kiss framed as artistic and emotional fulfillment is teaching its audience that sufficiently poetic, sufficiently intense declarations of desire from a student can and should dissolve the professional obligations an educator holds, when in fact the opposite is true. The intensity of a student's feeling is precisely the reason an educator's judgment and restraint matter most in that moment. It is also worth naming what this narrative choice risks communicating to queer audiences specifically, because stories about students developing intense crushes on teachers, professors, or mentors are extremely common and entirely unremarkable as a feature of growing up, queer or otherwise, but the responsible cultural work such stories can do lies in modeling what a caring adult does with that kind of devotion, not by rewarding it but by handling it with enough seriousness and self-awareness to protect the student while still treating her feelings with dignity rather than mockery or dismissal. And a narrative that instead uses the student's devotion as the direct engine of romantic payoff risks suggesting to young queer viewers that their most intense, formative crushes on authority figures are not simply a normal developmental experience to be outgrown or redirected, but an appropriate blueprint for how a real relationship might unfold if the feelings are strong enough or the writing beautiful enough. And this is a genuinely harmful message to send regardless of the tenderness of its execution, because it asks young audiences to see the crossing of this exact boundary as aspirational, rather than as a failure of the adult who should have known better. None of this diminishes the real value in Sovereign's poem as a piece of character work, because there is something genuinely worth honoring in a young woman's ability to reach for language capacious enough to hold feelings she does not yet fully understand. And a more responsible version of this story could have let that poem stand as exactly what it is: a document of a student's private, overwhelming experience of first intense attraction, without requiring Kira's response to validate or reciprocate it, allowing Sovereign's growth to come instead from learning to survive an unrequited or redirected feeling with her dignity intact, guided by a mentor who takes her seriously enough to help her understand what she is experiencing without exploiting the vulnerability that experience represents. And this alternate path would have offered considerably more value to queer audiences than the story as described currently provides, because it would model something rare and valuable: an adult meeting a young person's intensity with genuine care rather than personal gratification, which remains one of the most important and underrepresented dynamics available to stories about mentorship, education, and the particular vulnerability of first realizing the force of your own desire under the gaze of someone who holds real power over your life.